Hello everybody, my name is Happy and I'd like to welcome you to my History Reaction channel. Today we'll be looking at the worst president in American history by a relatively new channel known as Agent Flappy. Now because this is a new channel, it hasn't been around very long, I haven't seen any of his videos yet. A couple of them have shown up in my feed and I've seen a couple other history reactors have done a couple of his videos. And I see that his channel is actually doing pretty well for a channel as new as his. So I'm going into this pretty optimistically, and I'd like to just see what he has to offer us and whether it's really good or not. I kind of expect it will be, given how well he's doing. Anyway, as always, I will have a link to the original content down in the description below, and I will go into this with the warning that I am by no means an American president type historian. I know the broad strokes. I know a few details about a few specific presidents that I spent time on for one reason or the other. But overall, I am not a president's guy. If you want a good president's guy, I would suggest going over to Mr. Beat or even take a look at some of Chris over at Vlogging Through History's presidential history reactions. Those guys are president guys. I'm definitely not. But I'm pretty sure I can contribute at least a bit to this. One thing I am good at is trivia. The funny little things that are associated with presidents. I do know a lot of that, oddly enough. And I know enough I can probably add a decent amount. So let's just go ahead and get into this and see what we're up against.
From chasing down runaway slaves, to stealing millions from wounded veterans, to doing nothing while the country burned to the ground.
Buchanan.
These are the 10 worst presidents in American history.
All right.
And they're so bad, even I could do a better job. But first,
don't be so sure about
Benjamin
that.
Harrison, who isn't exactly a household name. In fact, if you showed his face to 100 Americans, most would say, "Isn't that the guy from the Titanic?" But
I can absolutely see that.
A huge mark.
Yeah.
Mainly
Crash of 1893 is pretty much his responsibility. It happens after he leaves office, but it's his policies that make it happen.
by wrecking the economy and then vanishing before he could take the blame.
Yeah.
Because in 1890, Harrison signed the McKinley Tariff, jacking up tariffs to nearly 50%. The idea was to protect American businesses, but what actually happened was prices skyrocketed.
Yep.
Foreign trade collapsed, and farmers got absolutely smoked.
Yeah, tariffs are a two-edged sword. Yes, they can be used constructively if they're used judiciously and carefully, but they can also do a great amount of harm and they can have a lot of unforeseen consequences, as some of us are learning now. And something that it applies to this situation is that a lot of times economic policies, whether it's by the government in general or especially by the president, take a while for the ramifications to show. So it's not at all uncommon for the effects of some of these policies to not show up for a year or two or three. That's why, even though he signed this in 1890, the big crash occurs in 1893, but it's directly tied to some of the things that are happening earlier.
And as if that wasn't enough, he burned through the entire federal surplus like a kid after his first paycheck. But the worst part, none of this came crashing down until after he left office.
Again, not unusual. It's not uncommon for a president to have to clean up the financial crisis created by his predecessor. That's very common, in fact.
When the Panic of 1893 devastated the economy and President Grover Cleveland was left dealing with the dumpster fire. No fair! But Harrison? He was long gone, chilling back in Indiana, writing books and pretending like nothing happened.
Yep.
So no, Benjamin Harrison didn't commit crimes or start wars. He just played Jenga with the economy and walked away as it collapsed. But none of that was as bad as Millard Fillmore, who turned every citizen into a slave hunter.
Fugitive Slave Act definitely belongs on the list of, I would say, the top 10 worst. Really bad decision to pass that particular law.
Because in 1850, the nation was divided over slavery. The South was loving it. The North, not so much. But the South was threatening to secede. So in an effort to compromise and preserve the Union, Fillmore signed the Fugitive Slave Act. legally requiring every U.S. citizen to assist in the capture of runaway slaves. In other words, if a slave showed up on your doorstep and you offered them a glass of water, it could land you in prison, even if you lived in a free state.
Yeah, I mean, that's a slight exaggeration, but the idea is valid enough. So much for states' rights, South. I guess they're okay as long as they're protecting you, but doesn't matter if they infringe on the right of other states. The Fugitive Slave Act is easily one of the worst laws we've ever had. I wouldn't call it the worst, but it's definitely up there. It really helped escalate this descent towards, I hate using escalate followed right by descent. I don't see a better way to say it. It really helps to escalate the deteriorating conditions between the North and South, because now the northern free states are required to help capture and return escaped slaves. So,
That's
not going to go over well.
But as you may have guessed, this backfired. Because normal people who never cared about slavery were suddenly like, wait, what the is going on?
Yep.
With abolitionist movements growing overnight and more normies becoming radicalized by the day.
Yeah, because the whole idea that if I don't help capture and turn in this slave, I can be prosecuted is an issue. Whereas the people who were on the fence or just didn't care are now being given a reason to get off the fence or to care.
So while Fillmore thought he was keeping the peace, he ended up pouring fuel on the fire, pushing the nation one step closer towards civil war. But that's not as embarrassing as this next president, William Henry Harrison, who holds the record for the shortest president.
He does not belong on the list of the worst presidents. I see him there all the time, and I just don't think it's fair to him, because it's not like he did anything terrible. It's just that he did not survive long enough to do anything at all. And that doesn't really, in my book anyway, make him a terrible president. It makes him a very unlucky president.
Presidency in American history. Because in 1841, Harrison was 68 years old, one of the oldest presidents elected at the time. So, to prove he still had energy for the job, he delivered the longest inauguration speech ever recorded.
I take that back. He belongs on the list just for that, because if there's anything a president can do bad, it's making a multiple-hour inauguration speech. Bad form. Terrible
Nearly
taste.
2 hours long. Man's out here with no coat, no hat, and no common sense. The old man just wanted to prove he still had it.
Yep.
A lot like your grandpa trying to do a kickflip on your skateboard. But a few weeks later, he came down with a bad cold.
And see, right there is why, one of the reasons why I don't buy into this whole he died of a cold because of that. You don't get a cold from standing out in the rain 2 weeks later and die even much later than that. I think it was 31 days later. I don't remember exactly. But yeah, if it takes you 2 weeks to catch a cold from that, it's not that. Something else. And current consensus seems to be bad water. A lot of people in and around that part of D.C. were dying of bad water-related complications. Yeah, the water from the White House and from the surrounding area were just bad. It was killing off a lot of people.
That turned into pneumonia. For most of history, we thought it came from his crazy speech in the rain. But modern historians believe it was more likely typhoid from contaminated drinking water at the White House.
Yep.
Either way,
typhoid, cholera, there's a lot of things you can get from the water.
31 days after taking office, William Henry Harrison was dead.
Yep.
He didn't sign a single law or make one decision. Instead, he spent more time writing an inauguration speech than being an actual president.
Yeah, but that doesn't make him a bad president. Makes him an unlucky one, like I said. For me, to be a bad president, you have to do something bad. And I think it's fair to say that if you do nothing when you could have prevented something bad qualifies, but that doesn't apply here either.
And to make matters worse, he triggered a constitutional crisis.
Not
because
his
at
fault.
the time, nobody knew what happens after a president dies in office. It wasn't 100% clear if the vice president simply acted as president or became president outright. Thankfully, John Tyler stepped up and said, "I'm president now." And everyone just kind of went along with it.
You kind of have to because it isn't clear, so you might as well just go by whatever the first person says.
But what was William Henry Harrison's legacy? No scandals, no war, no nothing. Just one epic speech and a short stay at the White House.
Yep.
If there were a Hall of Fame for how to completely blow a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, Harrison would be a first ballot member. But
again, though, not really his fault. I can kind of agree with him being in that Hall of Fame, other than it implies that he did it on purpose or through incompetence, and none of that really applies. I don't think he belongs on this list. I don't think he belongs on really any presidential list of this type, best or worst, because we got nothing to judge him by.
But at least he didn't, completely destroy America, like Franklin Pierce.
Franklin Pierce,
who,
yep.
Came pretty dang close.
Yeah, Pierce, I would definitely put him on my list of the worst presidents. Probably bottom 5. He was pretty bad. He was a Southern sympathizer. He's going to be president when the Kansas-Nebraska Act goes into effect. Easily one of the worst decisions in American history. I wouldn't put it as the worst, but it's up there.
'Cause with his movie star good looks and smooth-talking speeches, Pierce became elected to deal with the whole slavery problem.
Yeah.
But he quickly made one giant mistake. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854.
Absolutely.
You see, back then there was a bunch of unorganized land after the Louisiana Purchase. State lines were still being drawn, and the Kansas-Nebraska Act established the areas as U.S. territories. But it also stated that popular sovereignty would determine if slavery was allowed in each territory.
Right, so popular sovereignty, people get to vote on whether slaves are going to be allowed there or not. This is a direct violation of the previous Missouri Compromise, and I don't think I have to explain why this is a bad idea, because you end up with people flooding into the territories to try to sway the vote. And it gets bloody. You get the term bleeding Kansas from this. It is a disaster, and it was a foreseeable disaster. You didn't have to even have more than a passing understanding of human nature and politics to understand this was going to be a disaster.
In other words, the new settlers would vote on it, reversing the long-standing Missouri Compromise, which banned it above a certain line. So, what was the result?
Exactly.
Pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces flooded Kansas with rifles, torches, and angry mobs. The territory quickly descended into chaos and bloodshed. Houses were burned, families slaughtered, and the 5-year bloodbath was nicknamed Bleeding Kansas. So what did Franklin Pierce do to stop it? Pretty much nothing. In fact, he backed the pro-slavery side, which formed an illegitimate government through voter fraud and violence. He even sent in federal troops to stabilize the new government. Pretty crazy times.
Yes, it was.
Because instead of calming tensions between the North and South, Pierce accelerated the nation's march towards...
We had a whole slew of really bad presidents there, all of which contributed to the escalation or the descent toward civil war. Pierce and then after him Buchanan are probably the 2 worst, but yeah.
Civil war. But this next president is one you might not expect.
Oh,
and
I
that's
absolutely
Woodrow
expect
Wilson,
it.
Who's known for his life.
For a long time, he was highly ranked. His star had been descending pretty rapidly in recent years, and it's way past time. I think a part of that is because, and like Grant, for example, used to be very poorly rated, but he's been writing a lot in recent years. And I think a lot of that has to do with changing criteria when judging these presidents, because I think there was a lot more emphasis on things like corruption in the past, which put Grant down, for example, and it's going to push Harding down, it's going to, things like that. Character, so on, was much more of a factor. Whereas nowadays they look more at the policies themselves and the repercussion of those policies, and that's causing some of these presidents to kind of flip-flop where they are on the scale.
Lofty ideals like championing the League of Nations and making the world safe for democracy.
He wanted to.
And hey, he did some pretty good stuff, like lead us through World War I. But here's the problem. Back at home, he
The problem? There's a lot of problems, but let's see what he got to say.
levied some of the worst attacks on American freedoms in U.S. history.
Yes.
During World War I,
Yeah, his attacks on free speech, so on and so forth. sedition acts, things like that. He kind of rehashes some stuff that John Adams had already done with his Alien and Sedition Acts. Wilson kind of brings some of that back.
He signed the Espionage Act and Sedition Act, making it a crime to criticize the government, the military, or even the flag. And hey, I love America just as much as the next guy. I'm a friggin' bald eagle. But this was downright crazy.
It was.
Because
both times that it happened.
Under his administration, over 2,000 Americans were prosecuted, like journalists, union leaders, and everyday citizens who dared to speak their minds. Free speech, the bedrock of American democracy, was crushed under the weight of wartime paranoia. But Wilson thought it was totally worth it. 'Cause after World War I, he pushed for the League of Nations,
he did.
The first worldwide intergovernmental organization designed to maintain world peace.
Yeah, but he didn't get enough support for it back here at home, so we never joined it.
But there was one little problem. It was rejected by the U.S. Senate, out of fear that it would drag America into European wars. He couldn't believe it. But here's the funny part. The League of Nations still ended up happening with 63 other countries, just without the U.S. So Wilson was left crying outside the club. And to cap it all off, he punished Germany so severely after World War I with the Treaty of Versailles that it sowed the seeds for World War II.
Yeah, but you can't really lay all that on Wilson. That was a joint effort by all the Allies at the time. Britain and France had as much to do with that as Wilson ever did. But there's other things you can put at Wilson's feet. He desegregated the government. I guess you should say he segregated the government because he removed African American from government positions. He helped bring about the resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan, not only because of his policies like removing African American from the government, but also through more subtle things like airing the Birth of Nations in the White House, which was, as far as I'm concerned, a love letter to the KKK. He helped embolden them. He helped embolden supremacists during his reign. He had a messiah complex. He felt he could do no wrong and that anybody who disagreed with him was an imbecile. All around, I can't think of really anything positive to say about Wilson, other than he was something of an idealist, but he never really got any of those ideals to take off because he was just not good at getting people to do or follow some of his ideas. He was naive in some regards. Let's see what else he's got to say.
In the end, Wilson became a prisoner of his own ego. A man so obsessed with his vision, he refused to bend, causing chaos at home and abroad. And Wilson's presidency had some eerily similar parallels to this next guy.
Oh, no.
George W. Bush, who entered the White House with a hand.
I kind of think it's too recent to really judge Bush. To really put presidents on lists like this, you need to give sufficient time for a good legacy to be established. And Bush is kind of at the edge of that right now, I think. But yeah, his administration was, 17 years ago now it ended? That's not that long ago. It's a little early to be talking about how good or bad he was, for the most part. Let's see what he got to say.
In a smirk, until history threw him every disaster short of a meteor strike.
And I'm sure that was on the list too. Yeah, Bush did get off to a rocky start through no fault of his own. I'll give him that. And he handled the first crisis, 9/11, very well, I think. It's just the subsequent stuff that comes back to bite him.
First, 9/11. And to his credit, Bush brought the whole country together for about 6 months. But what followed reshaped the entire world, pretty much for the worse. First came the decision to invade Iraq, based on bad intelligence that Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction.
I really don't know how much Bush knew about that, so I can't make any judgments there. But regardless of how much he knew, he is the buck stops here guy. He is ultimately responsible either way.
Turns out, he didn't. But by then, the U.S. was locked into a $1 trillion war that cost over 4,400 American lives, wounded tens of thousands more, and destabilized the Middle East for decades. Thanks for your service. But like Woodrow Wilson, Bush gutted the civil liberties of Americans at home by passing the Patriot Act in October.
That, I think, is going to be one of the long-term consequences that's going to put him down low on the list. I'm not arguing that he doesn't belong low on the list. I'm just not sure he belongs this low on the list. I would definitely put him above Wilson in any case. But the Patriot Act, not a good look. I didn't like it at the time. I understood the reasoning behind some of it, but I'm one of those guys who thinks that there are lines you just don't cross. And the Patriot Act crosses some of those.
Of 2001, which dramatically expanded surveillance powers of the federal government, allowing the NSA and FBI to surveil U.S. citizens without a warrant. Hey, is this thing recording me? So, although you can argue this was necessary at the time, many of these powers still exist today. I don't
Exactly. That's one of those things that needed to have a strict limit on it, on how long it would last, possibly to be renewed periodically to a point, but it needed to have definite finite. It ends here unless the entire thing is completely repassed anew. And it doesn't have that.
These guys would be too happy about a surveillance state.
A surveillance state, I don't think any of those guys would have been happy about that. But Washington was really big into spycraft. So having incredibly good spy capabilities, I think Washington would have been all for that. Spying on his own people, I don't think so.
Then came Hurricane Katrina, where the levees broke, New Orleans flooded, and the federal government's response was, we're working on it. Because as people were left stranded on rooftops, the government set up the Louisiana Superdome as the shelter of last resort. But when 30,000 people showed up, it turned out to be a nightmare. The roof was damaged, the power failed, and toilets overflowed, which just stinks. The whole fiasco reeked of government inefficiency, and Bush was the poster child.
Yeah.
So not only was Bush messing things up back then, but Americans are still living with the consequences today. But speaking of messing stuff up, after Abraham Lincoln was assassinated,
Johnson definitely belonged on the list, for sure.
America needed a steady hand to unite the country. Instead, it got Andrew Johnson, a former slaveholder from Tennessee who, believe it or not, didn't exactly believe in racial equality. He vetoed the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which would grant citizenship and basic rights to formerly enslaved people. Things like the right to make contracts, own property, and be treated equally under the law. What the heck, man? But Congress wasn't having it. They overrode his veto and pushed through the 14th Amendment, locking those rights into the Constitution. But Johnson didn't back down. He found other ways to prop up the South, like issuing mass pardons to tens of thousands of Confederates. Because
okay, I think that was always going to happen, regardless of who was president. Now, how far it extended is another story, because you got, the rank and file of the Confederacy. Do you pardon them? I think the idea of pardoning the average everyday citizen of the Confederacy was probably a good call. I think just about any president would have done that. The real question is, what do you do about the ringleaders, the guys that were running the show? That's where it gets sticky.
It's kind of a big deal when you take up arms against the United States. Most governments would throw you in jail or hang you for
You're going to throw in jail everybody living in the South, or even just all the soldiers. The war's over. What are you going to do? You can't just keep all the people in prison. When we win a war, we don't lock up everybody in the country. This is no different. Again, it's all about where do you draw this line of who gets pardoned and who doesn't. Do you want to have a line there? If you do need to have a line, where does that line sit?
Reason. But Johnson restored their rights and let them retake power in the South. His logic? We shouldn't kick the losers while they're down.
Not just that, but this is part of our country. we're reuniting the United States. That's the whole purpose of the Civil War. And treating the South as an occupied country might be a little necessary in the short term, especially in terms of ensuring that the slaves remain free and get at least a modicum of rights, but not like we can occupy them forever or hold them all prisoner or execute them all. Something's got to give. Johnson, there were some controversies there, to be sure. I know they did have some dividing lines. I can't remember all the details, but I believe there was like a $20,000 clause where people who earned more than $20,000 had to pledge their allegiance to the United States before they could be pardoned. Something to that effect. It's been years since I've gone deep into Reconstruction. I've recently started getting back into it, but I literally just started like this past week. So I know that Johnson himself had a beef with the planter aristocracy and wanted to make it really hard for some of the rich plantation owners to get back on their feet, at least initially. But yeah, really complicated thing. But pardoning people was, I think, always going to be on the table. The only real question was who was going to be pardoned, who wasn't, and what conditions, if any, were there going to be. One other exception that I know of is if they did debate how to deal with people who had sworn to protect the United States and uphold the Constitution, for example, former Congress members and former public servants, how to deal with people who had broken that oath. And I think that was handled a little differently. But anyway, let's just get into this, because like I said, this is not one of my areas of specialty. I've recently got back into it, but not far enough to speak with any real confidence on any of it.
But as you might have guessed, his plan backfired, because this started the Jim Crow era, created fertile ground for the Ku Klux Klan, and stoked racial tensions nationwide. In Congress's eyes, Johnson had basically undone the point of winning the whole Civil War, so they impeached him.
Yeah, but they impeached him for entirely different things. I'm sure that was a large part of their actual motivation, but they basically set him up. They passed some rules explicitly designed to entrap Johnson. And then when he sprung that trap, they impeached him. So that was kind of dirty pool on their part. But I think this was their actual motivation, even though this wasn't what they actually used for the impeachment.
The first presidential impeachment in U.S. history,
and
where Johnson faced trial in the Senate and survived conviction by just one vote. Phew,
yep.
That was close. As you can tell, post-Civil War America was crazy. We needed a leader to rise above the hate and pull the country forward. Instead, Johnson doubled down on division. But if you thought that was bad, get ready for Herbert Hoover, who promised Americans a chicken in every pot and a car in every garage. And honestly, people believed him.
Yeah, Hoover belongs on the list. But again, I'd put him a little higher on the list than some of these other people. I'd put him higher than Pierce. I'd put him higher than Buchanan. I'd put him higher than Wilson, honestly. He belongs here for his mishandling of the Great Depression, and especially for his disastrous handling of the World War I veteran, for lack of a better word, strike, where the veterans wanted pay they were promised and marched on Washington to ask for the pay and had the military sicked on him instead. He definitely deserves to be knocked down for all of that. I just don't know that he needs to be this low on the list.
Because on paper, Hoover had a glittering resume.
Oh, yes, he did.
Self-made millionaire, humanitarian, and a respected public servant.
Yeah, so he was an engineer, he was a self-made millionaire, and he was not just a humanitarian. In his time, he was known as the Great Humanitarian. And there are historians that have argued that Herbert Hoover has saved more lives than any other individual in history. And they have a good argument for that case. Hoover was the head of American Relief during and after World War I, getting food and medical supplies and all that kind of stuff to people suffering in war-torn Europe after World War I. and then later into things like the Russian famine of the early 1920s. Hoover was a great organizer. He organized this very well. He got food to people who needed it, when they needed it, where they needed it. He deserves that title of great humanitarian. But what he could do for other countries in other circumstances, he wasn't able to as effectively do for American citizens when the Great Depression hit. And it's not that I don't think he could have gotten things like administrated a relief association and so on. The problem, I think, with Hoover is that he didn't feel that he had a right to, or the authority to interfere with a lot of what was going on with the Depression. He let his sense of what I am and am not allowed to do to interfere with actually doing something about the crisis.
This guy was going to usher America into a new golden age. Until the Great Depression hit. Just months into his term, the stock market crashed and Hoover froze. As a staunch capitalist, he believed the government intervention would only make things worse. So
wrong intervention certainly could, but there were things that could be done and needed to be done that didn't happen because of this belief. And he's hardly the first person in the history to make this mistake. But yeah, it hurt him a lot. It hurt the American people a lot.
We sat back and let private charities and local governments handle the crisis. The results? Banks collapsed. Businesses shuttered. And unemployment soared to 25%. I'm going broke out here, man! But the final blow came in 1932 with the bonus army protest.
Absolutely.
Where 15,000 World War I.
This, for me, is what puts him low on the list. He deserves to be vilified for this. No getting around it.
Veterans marched peacefully on Washington, D.C., demanding early payment of bonuses they were promised, money they desperately needed to survive. And Hoover's response? He sent in the U.S. Army. Led by General Douglas MacArthur, federal...
Additional negative points for putting Arthur in charge of this. I'm not a MacArthur fan, sorry to say, but I'm not.
Troops used tear gas, tanks, and bayonets to violently clear the encampment. And when photographs of assaulted veterans hit the front page of newspapers across America, it was game over.
Yeah, that's a really bad look. That's not a look you want when you're a politician.
Hoover's legacy was sealed, not as a helper, but as a cold, clueless man who fumbled the Great Depression and turned tanks against our own veterans. No list of terrible presidents will be complete without the guy who watched the Civil War unfold from the front row and did nothing. An event so devastating, it almost killed the country forever.
Sorry about that, folks. I just had a really bad coughing fit. That came out of nowhere, so I had to pause it real quick. I hope I didn't screw anything up too badly. Anyway, continuing on.
When James...
Let me back this up just a bit.
And so devastating, it almost killed the country forever. When James Buchanan took office in 1857, the nation was already tearing at the seams over slavery. He had a choice. Take action and lead, or do nothing.
He definitely did nothing, and that's not the worst that he did, but of those two choices, I would say he definitely picked door number 2.
Instead, he chose door number 3 and let the Supreme Court handle it, which led to the infamous Dred Scott decision that said...
That's really not Buchanan's fault, though. The Supreme Court is the Supreme Court. They are a separate but equal branch of the government. He has no real control over that.
Black Americans could never be citizens. And Buchanan celebrated. It was over in his mind. He even pressured justices behind the scenes to make a sweeping pro-slavery ruling, thinking this would settle the issue once and for all. Spoiler alert, it didn't.
Yeah, Dred Scott decision is easily one of the worst Supreme Court decisions of all time. It definitely made things way worse.
Instead, it lit a fire under the North. And 3 years later, Abraham Lincoln, who opposed the expansion of slavery, won the presidency without a single Southern electoral vote. Nice work, Top Hat.
Nice takedown, Lincoln. He was a champion wrestler, by the way. He could have done that, probably.
The South panicked. With no more national power, Southern states began seceding from the Union before Lincoln took office. And Buchanan, who is still president, insisted that secession was illegal.
Yeah, he acknowledged it was illegal, but he did nothing about it. I don't know what he could have done. It was pretty much inevitable at this point, but he at least could have started making preparations for a civil war, taken steps to get ready for what was coming, and tried to do something to prevent it. But reality is he just basically sat back and did nothing.
But also claimed the federal government had no authority to stop it. Thanks for nothing, dude. By the time Buchanan left office, 7 states were gone. Federal forts had been seized, and America was free-falling into civil war. Buchanan's legacy isn't defined by scandal or one bad law. It's defined by his failure to act when the nation's very survival was at stake.
That's absolutely fair, and that's why I would definitely put him really low on this list. Like I said, I don't know what he could have done, but the fact that he did nothing is the issue.
Sheesh. I mean, it couldn't possibly get any worse than that, right? Well, believe it or not, it does. Because this is the...
Harding, I don't agree with this. He's long time been one of the bottom presidents on most lists. I don't really think he belongs there. Oh, he belongs low in the tier list, absolutely. But this low, no. He's not worse than Buchanan. He's not worse than Pierce. He's not worse than Wilson. Harding, well, let's just see what he got to say.
Worst president in U.S. history. His name is Warren G. Harding, a man so unqualified for the job, he even admits it. Harding once privately said, "I am not fit for this office and should never have been here."
I can believe that.
And he wasn't wrong, because Harding ran...
He definitely wasn't a great president, but I think he gets pushed down a lot more than he deserves. I mean, he does deserve to be pushed down, no question, but this far, no.
On returning America to normalcy. Instead, he delivered the most corrupt administration of all time, stacking his cabinet with the Ohio Gang, a crew of poker buddies, party friends, and political cronies who looted the government like a bank robbery. Take the Teapot Dome scandal, where a Secretary of the Interior secretly leased federal oil reserves to private companies in exchange for bribes. Bad? Oh, you bet. But not as bad as the head of the Veterans Bureau, who embezzled millions meant for wounded soldiers. Or his Attorney General, who allegedly took kickbacks to look the other way while criminals ran wild during Prohibition. And while all of this was happening, Harding spent his days golfing, gambling, and drinking, which was illegal during the Prohibition, by the way.
Point of order, drinking alcohol was not illegal. Producing and selling alcohol was illegal.
The way, he even had multiple affairs while in office.
Now, that may have been different on local level, but in terms of the actual Volstead Act, the prohibition, drinking wasn't prohibited. It was selling and manufacture of alcohol.
This dude's the worst. Harding.
So yeah, let's just see what else he got for us here.
Even admitted, "I have no trouble with my enemies.
Oh, I love
this. I can take care of my enemies in a fight. But my damn friends, they're the ones that keep me walking the floor at nights."
He did say that, and I love that quote. Or at least that quote is attributed to him anyway. I've always loved that one.
It's maybe the guilt started eating away at him, because Warren G. Harding died of a heart attack in 1923.
It's not that. It's because he came in close proximity to Robert Lincoln. Yes, I'm just kidding. But yeah, if you're not aware, Robert Lincoln, every time he got near a president, that president died soon after. So yeah, and Robert Lincoln was in Washington for the dedication of the Lincoln Memorial not too terribly long before Harding dies.
Mid-scandal, leaving the country shocked at the rot inside his administration. Harding's presidency didn't just damage trust in government, it shattered it. But hey, maybe that was a good thing, because today, we're still skeptical of political corruption, even with it happening in front of our faces. how's that stock portfolio going up?
Yeah, that's something that always bothered me, was high-level politicians being able to invest in the stock market, because their policies can influence whether things go up and down, which can help make them wealthier if they know which way it's going to go. I just don't see how it's not something akin to insider trading. But that's a debate for a whole other thing.
But there you have it. The worst presidents in American history. Not only did they stink at their jobs, they nearly broke the country.
Yeah, Harding, like I said, he belongs in the discussion. I just don't think he belongs in the #1 spot. He was extremely popular during his presidency, one of the most popular ever as far as I know. It's only afterwards, when people found out about the corruption of his Ohio gang friends there, that his reputation took a hit. His moral character became more questionable. Not so much because he did anything corrupt in the office that anybody's aware of, but certainly his sleeping around hurt him. But I don't know. I just don't know that he did enough really bad things in office himself that warrant him being really low. It's more that he let his cronies get away with a lot that really pushes him down. And he does deserve to go down because of that. Because the buck stops here guy again. He's the guy who's ultimately responsible. But I don't think he belonged below some of these other guys. I just don't agree with that. He belongs in the gang here, yeah, but not that low. Anyway, overall good video. Let's see if the got anything else to say here.
But if you thought their legacies were dark, wait until you hear how they died. One choked on cherries. Another dropped dead from a stroke.
What?
And yeah, one got assassinated.
Oh, okay, he's talking about his next video. I'm like, wait a minute. None of these guys died that way.
In broad daylight.
Okay,
This is how every president died in their last words.
Okay, now that might be a fun one to look at later. Not so much for how they died, but the last words are fascinating. I know several of them. Washington was supposedly "'tis well," I believe. Yeah, I think I want to look into that one eventually. But not a bad video. I enjoyed it. I take exception to some of his decisions, but more about the ordering than the people being included. And like I said, I kind of feel there's still a bit of a recency bias with Bush. I'm not sure if we should really be evaluating presidents that recent in a list like these. But that's just a personal opinion. Bush is kind of on the edge of that, so I can kind of see it. And yeah, he belongs down towards the bottom, because if nothing else, for the Patriot Act. That was a horrible idea, and getting us in all these Middle East wars that we didn't need to be in. It's one thing to react against 9/11. It's another thing to use that momentum to go after a bunch of other agendas that are only peripherally related. But yeah, I kind of think he belongs in discussion, but I'm not sure he belongs in the bottom 10, maybe. I just think it's a little early to say for sure. Anyway, enough about that. Anyway, I want to thank you for joining me, and I hope you enjoyed this. I hope I didn't make too much of a fool of myself. Like I said, this is not one of my stronger areas overall. None of the presidents I know even a decent amount about were on this list, so there's that. But yeah, I hope I contributed something. Anyway, until next time, I'll see you all later. Bye-bye.